Hey, welcome to the third episode of the Rumination Project. And today we are going to talk about trauma and the basic definition of what trauma is. There seems to be a really big misunderstanding of what trauma is. A lot of people don't understand they actually carry trauma around. I know that there's a lot of data that shows that about 70% of the human population have a traumatic have trauma, but I honestly think it's way higher than that. I think that every single human carries around trauma once I actually explain the definition. And again, I'm going to share a video here. I don't claim to know everything, and sometimes I find a really good video online that really supports and hits what I'm trying to explain. So I'm going to play a video by her name is Dr. Tori Olds, and she has a YouTube channel that you can subscribe to as well. It looks like she is a therapist and a traumatic therapist and helps people deal with their own trauma. So I'm going to play what her definition of trauma is. I think it's the most current, up-to-date definition of what trauma is. I know there's a lot of old definitions that say trauma is a very serious life or death event that happens in your life, but it actually is. It's the scope of the scale of it is way bigger than that. That term is way too general. Um, she does a very good job of explaining it, so I'll play the video now.
Before we start, let's really take time to look at what trauma is and is not. So trauma is not an event. Trauma is more about the impact, the lasting impact that an event or an experience has on the functioning of our nervous system. So, by the way, when we use the word nervous system here, we're really talking about basically the brain. It's just that trauma people tend to use the word nervous system instead of brain because brain, when we think of that word, we think of like the organ that's just encased in the skull. Whereas really it's like a whole system that is embodied. We pick up sensory information, it moves upward, it's processed or ignored. Then information comes back down and signals to shift our physiology and lift our heart rate. So when we're working with trauma, we tend to use the word nervous system to really get that we're looking at the whole system, both how the brain and body come together. But when I use the word nervous system, basically think of it as brain. So backtracking then to this definition of when an event has a lasting impact on the nervous system or the functioning of the nervous system, another way to say that would be trauma is when an experience rewires our brain in a negative direction. So there are two parts then of this to describe. One is the type of event or experience, and the other is the impact. So first, a traumatic event. Sometimes you'll still read, and we certainly used to think of a traumatic event as by definition being life or death, like where someone's physical safety was threatened or they saw someone else's safety being threatened. And the new DSM has actually expanded that a little bit, which is a good thing because thinking of trauma as just life or death situations is a bit too narrow. More and more people are looking less at like the type of event and more the type of experience that event creates. And in particular, when we're thinking about trauma, we're usually talking about experiences where someone felt particularly overwhelmed and in some way trapped or powerless. Like there's a threat that brought up a lot of activation, a lot of intensity, but no way to have an empowered response that makes them feel good about their own ability to deal with that threat. So if we have an experience where we feel particularly threatened or humiliated and have no opportunity to really effectively protect ourselves, that's going to leave a strong impression in our brain that the world is dangerous, and also, by the way, we are ineffective in dealing with that. So let me just say that all one more time. So if there is a danger from the outside, but we are able to successfully protect ourselves, then we're learning that yes, the world is dangerous, but I am very strong and danger is no big deal, we can just move past it. But if there is a danger and we are either physically held down or frozen or trapped, it's going to have a stronger impression that the world is dangerous in a way that I need to stay amped up and on guard. It's like our brain will have a harder time leaving and moving through that experience of being anxious, terrified, frozen. But in that state, we have less access to all our resources that usually empower us. So one way you can think about what trauma work is how to help clients come back into enough flow, enough sense of safety that they can re-access their normal resources, their normal strength, kind of learn about empowerment and find that empowered stance again. That way we can help our clients leave a sort of survival mode of sorts, one in which their physiology is characterized by less integration and regulation. Because when you're in that more survival mode, it will deeply impact how you feel in the world, how you perceive the outer world, how you move through your internal states, and in particular, how we live in our bodies. Because when we're in that mode, we will err either toward hyperarousal, in other words, being flooded with anxiety or being jumpy or easy to startle or panic, or hypoarousal, kind of feeling shut down or numbed or with a tendency to isolate. So that's just a summary of overarching picture of what trauma is. And the next section we'll look at the different kinds of trauma.
So that's a very good definition of the new, I guess, definition of what trauma is. A lot of people, like I said, don't even realize that they carry the trauma around with them, and it really comes into play in a lot of different ways in your life. It always influences you in a bad way if you do not take care of it. And this may shock a lot of people, but you get diseases and cancer if you do not deal with trauma. Trauma can turn the body and make it ill. And she kind of just explained that through the nervous system. So basically, if you're not dealing with trauma, that trauma will go to somewhere in the body and make you ill, and can give you cancer at one point in your life as you're older if you never deal with the trauma. And there are actually plenty of studies to prove that that's true. And I'm sure that we know somebody who actually got cancer because they never dealt with their own underlying trauma. So I'm going to explain the signs of what unresolved trauma is and how it kind of relates to behavior that you can see. These are 20 signs of unresolved trauma. Number one is addictive behaviors. People who excessively turn to drugs, alcohol, sex, shopping, gambling as a way to push different emotions and upset trauma content further away. And I'm sure that you know a lot of people who turn to alcohol when they're very stressed out. And alcohol is it's not very good to take if you're depressed. It will make you even more depressed, especially the next day after the compound that's in alcohol gets into your brain, and it starts to affect your brain in a very bad way. It also gets into your gut and starts to influence your sleep. And people who drink a lot don't understand why they get lousy sleep or why they're always tired. And it's because because they probably drink a lot of alcohol, and it's messing with their gut with that. And your gut regulates your sleep cycle. Number two, the inability to tolerate conflicts. An inability to tolerate conflicts with others, as in having a fear of a conflict, running from conflict, avoiding conflict, or maintaining skewed perceptions of conflict. Number three, an inability to tolerate intense feelings. An inability to tolerate intense feelings, preferably to avoid feeling by any means of ways. Number four, innate belief that they are bad. That is obviously one of the big signs of somebody mentally ill or developing a mental illness is they start to feel worthless, and that voice inside of them starts to feed a very negative voice in their life, and they start to believe it. Number five, black and white thinking is basically all or nothing thinking, even if this approach ends up harming themselves. I believe that means uh, thinking too much or not thinking at all. 6, suicidal thoughts. We obviously know what those are. Number 7, disorganized attachment patterns. Having a variety of short but intense relationships, refusing to have any relationships, dysfunctional relationships, or frequent love-hate relationships. And yeah, you can see that kind of rip through a lot of people. I myself was not in relationships for a long time because of my own trauma, and I refused to let anybody else in because I knew that it would be dysfunctional. And there's nothing wrong with coming to terms with that. I've now dealt with a lot of that, and I now can be in a lot more healthy relationships, and that's a huge sign to if you see somebody having those issues, that they have very underlying trauma that they have to deal with. And you should always deal with your trauma before you get into a relationship, because it can really harm that your relationship with other people. Number 8, disassociation, spacing out, losing time, missing time. I used to feel that a lot as well, because it's actually it's a symptom of bipolar and borderline personality disorder. You space out a lot, daydream a lot, to the point that you can't even concentrate. Number 9, eating disorders. Number 10, excessive sense of self-blame, taking an inappropriate responsibility for everything and blaming it on yourself, and making excessive apologies. Excuse me. And a lot of people, I know some people who do excessively apologize to the point that it kind of gets really annoying, and they don't mean to do it. It's just that they really truly feel that they're always at fault, and that they just have to excessively apologize. Number 11, inappropriate attachments to mother figures or father figures, even with dysfunctional or unhealthy people. Number 12, intense anxiety, and repeated panic attacks. And anxiety is one of the symptoms of trauma. And some people just think it's anxiety, but it's really, it's an underlying trauma that you never dealt with, that is severely intensified to an anxiety, and it can actually be in the, feel like PTSD. Everybody experiences PTSD. You don't have to be in a war or see a violent crime to experience PTSD and have those intense anxiety and panic attacks when you feel threatened. Number 13, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, bad memories, or nightmares. Upsetting visual images, obviously flashbacks, bad memories. You can also have unexplained body pain. That these, like I said, the nervous system is connected to the whole body, and trauma can cause pain in your body. Number 14, depression, ongoing chronic depression that never goes away no matter what you try to do, no matter how many medications you try to take. That is because you have trauma. It is a dent in your brain, and it causes you to be depressed, and you have to deal with that dent in your brain if you ever want it to actually go away. Number 15, victim role, repeatedly acting from a victim role in current day relationships. Number 16, the rescuer role, repeatedly taking on the rescuer role even when inappropriate to do so. Number 17, self-harm, self-mutilation, self-injury, or self-destruction. And self-destruction can also mean being arrested. That is when you basically do not care and you go out on some kind of crime spree, or you go to maybe assault somebody without any care in the world, and you end up in jail. That can be a form of self-destruction, and it's sometimes people don't even realize they're doing it. But it's usually more of a form of to get attention, because you lacked attention maybe as a child, or some form of some other trauma. Number 18, suicidal actions. So that is different than suicidal thoughts, actually. This is actually when you take actions and try to take your own life. Number 19, the perpetrator role, taking the perpetrator or the angry aggressor in relationships. And this usually is in the form of a man, an angry man in a relationship. It's usually how this turns out. There are, of course, aggressive females in relationships, but most of the time it's men, and most of the time it has to do with childhood trauma for a man. That's where a lot of that anger comes from, and it may be also from an unhealthy bonding relationship with his mother. That is a very important relationship for a man to feel safe, is to have a relationship with his mother, and that's obviously a whole different episode that we could go into there. Number 20 is intense fears, unexplained but intense fears of people, places, and things. And that is something a lot of people experience. I'm sure you've all had intense fears, maybe when you went somewhere and you didn't understand why. And that is because of trauma. And I think we need to become more aware of our own trauma. We don't need to be walking around and telling people I don't have no trauma, because we all do. This world every day is traumatic. Everything that happens changes our decision making tomorrow, and whether or not we choose to be negative, as in that'll be traumatic, or whether we choose it to be positive, is our choice. And there's nothing wrong with saying that you have trauma, and there's nothing wrong with dealing with it. Dealing with trauma should be an everyday thing that should be something as normal as brushing your teeth. And every day I try to, I guess, realize the things that are negative in my brain, and I try to process them and deal with them. And it's a learning process. We all have our own coping mechanisms, and whatnot. But probably the best way to deal with trauma is to just talk about it. Talk to somebody you trust. Open up. Don't feel ashamed, because most of the time that person has gone through something very similar, and they will understand. Do not try to do it alone. That's for sure. And that's basically all I wanted to do with this episode. I wanted to keep it short and sweet so people could actually listen to it and understand more about what trauma actually is. So, and till next time, that is episode 3, and you guys have a good night, and don't forget to love yourself.